There's a strange kind of courage in choosing to walk toward the very thing everyone else is running from. Tonight, we step into the world of the plague doctor. Physicians hired to enter homes everyone else avoided. Men who carried little certainty and even less protection. In later centuries, some would become famous for their long-beaked masks and wooden canes as they walk through towns emptying by the hour. Long after most people had barricaded their doors and given up hope. If you're enjoying these quiet journeys through history, a like and a subscribe means more than you'd think. And if you'd like, tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Now, let your body settle, let your breathing slow, and let's step into the past together. To understand why anyone would choose this work, we have to begin with the disease itself and the world it entered. In the 1340s, a devastating illness began moving west, along the great trade routes that connected Central Asia with Europe. It traveled quietly at first, hidden among merchants, cargo, and the small creatures that shared the journey. Fleas carried on rats, slipping unnoticed into grain sacks and ship holds. By the time people understood what was happening, it was already everywhere. The plague is believed to have reached Europe through several trading networks, including the busy port of Kaffa on the Black Sea, where a besieging army is said to have hurled plague-infected bodies over the city walls. One of history's earliest recorded attempts at biological warfare, though the full details of that account have been debated by historians ever since. What's certain is that the ships leaving that region carried far more than silk, spices, and grain. They carried a sickness that would soon reshape an entire continent. Once it reached European towns, it moved with a speed that defied explanation. A person could wake feeling perfectly well and be gone within days. Painful swellings, burning fevers, dark patches spreading beneath the skin as the body began to fail. Entire households vanished within a single week. Some towns lost more than half their population before the worst of it passed. The plague ignored wealth, status, and reputation entirely. A nobleman's stone walls offered little more protection than a peasant's wooden cottage. Every knock at the door carried the possibility of terrible news. Medieval medicine had no real answer. Physicians of the time believed illness spread through miasma, foul vapors rising from swamps, waste, and decay. It's a bit like blaming the smell of rain for the storm itself. Understandable, given what little they had to work with, but nowhere close to the truth. The plague left behind more than grief. Priests who once gave last rites refused to enter infected homes. Families that had stayed close for generations found themselves torn apart by fear. Across Europe, the quiet routines of daily life began to collapse, and it was into that emptiness that a new kind of physician would eventually step forward, willing to do the work that almost everyone else refused. As towns emptied of willing physicians, city councils faced a problem with no good solution. Someone had to examine the sick, record the dead, and advise frightened officials who no longer knew what to do. And so, out of necessity, a new kind of position was created, the plague doctor. A physician hired specifically to treat the infected when no one else would. These were rarely the most accomplished doctors of their time. Many established physicians, the ones with reputations to protect and wealthy patients to keep, quietly declined the role or left town altogether. So cities turned instead to younger doctors still building a name for themselves, to those who had failed to establish a successful practice elsewhere, or occasionally to men with little formal medical training at all, but enough courage or desperation to take the job anyway. The pay could be substantial by the standards of the time. Some towns offered salaries far beyond what an ordinary physician might earn. along with housing and, in certain cases, a promise of citizenship or elevated social standing. For a man with nothing to lose, it could look less like a death sentence and more like an opportunity. It's not so different from any high-risk, high-reward job today, the ones nobody wants to take until the compensation makes it hard to refuse. Contracts were often surprisingly specific. Some plague doctors were forbidden from treating any patient without a town escort present. Others were required to report deaths to officials, perform autopsies, or even attend the wills of the dying to ensure their final wishes were properly recorded. In some towns, the plague doctor became something between a physician, a notary, and a public official, all wrapped into one exhausted, overworked figure. Not every plague doctor stayed out of pure necessity. A few genuinely believed it was their duty, a calling rooted in faith, or a sense of purpose that outweighed their fear. Others were simply pragmatic, understanding that someone had to do this work, and reasoning it might as well be them. Whatever brought them to the role, once they accepted it, their lives changed completely. They were no longer ordinary physicians. They were about to become something the rest of the town both depended upon and feared to stand too close to. The image most people picture when they hear the words plague doctor, the long beaked mask, the wide-brimmed hat, the dark waxed robe, didn't actually exist during the first outbreaks of the Black Death. That now famous costume was designed later around 1619 by a French physician named Charles de Lorme, who served several European royal courts. It would go on to become one of the most enduring images in medical history, even though it had almost nothing to do with treating the disease itself. The design followed the medical thinking of the time. If illness spread through bad air, through miasma, then the solution was to filter that air before it ever reached the body. The mask's long beak wasn't decoration. It was, in effect, an early air filter, packed with dried flowers, herbs, spices, and sometimes a vinegar-soaked sponge meant to purify each breath before it reached the doctor's lungs. The rest of the outfit followed the same logic. A long coat, waxed or oiled to repel moisture, was worn to keep the miasma from settling onto the skin. Gloves protected the hands. A wide-brimmed leather hat marked the wearer as a physician from a distance, useful in towns where panic made every stranger a source of suspicion. Glass lenses were fitted into the eye holes of the mask, believed to keep infected air from entering through the eyes as well. In a strange way, it wasn't so different from the full-body protective suits doctors wear today when facing a dangerous outbreak. The goal was identical, even if the science behind it was almost entirely wrong. The doctors also carried a long wooden cane, which served a more practical purpose than the rest of the costume. It allowed them to examine a patient, lift clothing, or check for swellings without ever making direct physical contact, keeping some careful distance between themselves and the disease they still didn't fully understand. Whether the costume actually protected anyone remains uncertain. Some historians believe the layered clothing may have offered limited, accidental protection against fleas simply by covering the skin so thoroughly. Others see it as more symbolic than functional, a way to project authority and calm in the middle of chaos. Either way, the mask became the face of an entire era, one instantly recognizable centuries later, worn by men who had no idea whether it would save them or not. A plague doctor's day rarely began gently. He would rise before dawn, dress in the heavy protective layers that had become his second skin, and set out into a town that grew quieter with each passing week. The streets themselves told their own story: shuttered windows, doors marked with crosses or painted signs warning of sickness inside. The occasional cart moving slowly, collecting those who hadn't survived the night. His first stop was often whichever household had sent word that someone had fallen ill. He would knock, wait for permission, and step into homes that neighbors and even family members had already begun to avoid. There, using his long cane, he would examine the patient from a careful distance, checking for the telltale swellings beneath the arms or around the neck that confirmed what everyone already feared. Once a diagnosis was made, treatment began, though calling it treatment is generous by modern standards. Bloodletting was common, based on the belief that illness came from an imbalance of the body's fluids and could be drained away along with the disease itself. Doctors also lanced the swollen buboes, believing that releasing the built-up poison inside would help the body heal. In reality, this often did far more harm than good, though no one at the time had any way of knowing that. Other remedies bordered on the bizarre. Some physicians prescribed mixtures of crushed herbs, ground precious stones, and even ingredients like dried toad or viper flesh, believed to draw poison from the body through what was called curing like. Vinegar was used constantly, splashed on clothing, wiped across skin, even added to food, in the belief that its sharp scent could ward off bad air. It's not so different from how people today stock up on vitamin C at the first sign of a cold, reaching for something, anything that feels like it might help, even without solid proof behind it. Beyond medicine, the plague doctor's job extended into duties that had little to do with healing at all. He recorded the number of deaths in the parish registers, useful centuries later for historians trying to understand how deeply the plague had cut into a population. He advised town officials on which houses to quarantine, and in some places, he was even asked to witness wills, ensuring that a dying person's final wishes were properly documented before it was too late. By the end of most days, he had likely walked past more grief than any single person should witness in a lifetime. And yet tomorrow would ask the same of him again. By this point in our story, it's worth asking the question that sits at the center of everything. Why did these men keep walking into infected homes, day after day, when they had already watched so many of their own colleagues fall sick and die around them? The truthful answer is that no single reason explains it. For some, it was faith. Many plague doctors genuinely believed their work was a calling, a duty placed on them by something larger than themselves. If death was coming regardless, they reasoned, of better to spend whatever time remained doing something that mattered than to hide behind locked doors, waiting for it to arrive anyway. For others, the motivation was simpler and far more practical: money. The contracts plague doctors signed often paid extraordinarily well, and for a man with few other prospects, few other ways to build a name or provide for a family, the risk could feel almost secondary to the reward. Hunger and debt have a way of making danger feel more distant than it actually is. There was also, for some, a strange kind of resignation that quietly became its own form of courage. Once a person had witnessed enough death, watched enough neighbors, friends, and fellow physicians succumb to the same illness, fear itself seemed to lose some of its sharpness. It's not so different from how a person can grow numb to bad news after enough of it arrives in a single week. Not because the news matters less, but because the mind can only hold so much alarm before it starts to go quiet. And for a smaller number, there may have been something closer to purpose, a recognition that if they didn't walk through that door, no one else would. That someone had to record the dead, comfort the dying, and remind a terrified town that not everyone had abandoned it completely. Whatever combination of faith, money, numbness, or duty carried them forward, the risk was never abstract. Plague doctors died in significant numbers, their protective costumes offering only limited defense against a disease no one yet understood. Each morning they dressed, they had no real way of knowing whether they would see the evening, and yet, morning after morning, many of them did it anyway. History remembers most plague doctors only as anonymous figures beneath a mask. But a few names survived the centuries, offering us a closer look at the men behind the costume. One of the most remarkable was Guy de Chauliac, physician to the Pope in Avignon, during the first devastating wave of the Black Death in the 1340s. Unlike many physicians of his era, he refused to flee the city when the plague arrived. He continued treating the sick, recording his observations with a level of detail rare for the time, describing symptoms, treatments, and outcomes with the careful eye of a man determined to understand what he was witnessing. He would go on to catch the plague himself, not once, but twice, and survived both times, an outcome so unusual that some later scholars wondered whether his own remedies had somehow helped, or whether he had simply been fortunate. His written accounts became one of the most valuable medical records of the entire outbreak, studied by physicians for generations afterward. Another figure, better known today for an entirely different reason, spent part of his early career doing this same difficult work. Long before he became famous for his predictions and prophecies, a young Frenchman named Michel de Nostradame, known to history as Nostradamus, worked as a plague doctor in southern France. He rejected several of the standard treatments of his time, choosing instead to focus on cleanliness, fresh air, and simple remedies of his own design, including a rosehip preparation rich in vitamin C. Whether his methods were genuinely more effective than his contemporaries remains debated, but he treated patients across multiple outbreaks and avoided catching the illness himself for years, until a later outbreak claimed his own wife and children regardless. Then there was Charles de Lorme, the physician credited with designing the now iconic beaked mask and protective costume. He served no fewer than 3 French kings across his long career, treating plague patients directly while wearing the very costume he had invented. Whether by fortune, careful precaution, or simple luck, Delorme lived to the remarkable age of 96, at a time when most people were fortunate to see 50. 3 very different men, 3 very different outcomes, each stepping into the same impossible role in his own way. Every era of fear eventually gives way to something else, and for plague doctors, that change came slowly, over more than a century, rather than in any single dramatic moment. The great outbreaks themselves began to lessen in severity across Europe by the late 1600s and into the 1700s. Better sanitation in growing cities, improved quarantine practices at ports, and simple shifts in trade patterns all played a role, even before anyone understood the true cause of the disease. Fewer outbreaks meant less need for physicians whose entire purpose had been built around this one specific crisis. At the same time, medicine itself was beginning to change. The miasma theory that had shaped the plague doctor's mask, his treatments, his entire understanding of the disease, slowly started losing ground to new ways of thinking. It would still be another century before germ theory properly emerged and doctors finally understood that illness spread through microorganisms too small to see. But the old certainties were already beginning to crack. Physicians started questioning bloodletting. They started questioning the herb-stuffed beak and the vinegar-soaked cloth. It's a bit like watching an old piece of technology slowly get replaced. Not because anyone announces its ending, but because newer, better tools quietly make it unnecessary. By the time the last major outbreaks of plague faded from Western Europe, the role of the plague doctor had little left to do. Some transitioned into more conventional medical practices. Others simply retired from public life once the demand for their specific, terrible expertise disappeared. The mask and coat, once a common enough sight to barely draw a second glance in an affected town, slowly became something else entirely, a costume confined to old paintings, medical museums, and, eventually, imagination. What remained long after the last plague doctor hung up his beaked mask was the image itself. Strange, haunting, and strikingly memorable. It outlived the profession that created it by centuries, resurfacing again and again in art, in festivals, in stories told long after anyone alive still remembered what the mask had actually been for. The men were gone. The mask somehow never really left. So, after everything we've walked through tonight, it's worth sitting with the question we started with. Were plague doctors heroes quietly stepping into danger that everyone else refused to face? Or were they simply men shaped by circumstance, drawn forward by money, duty, faith, or the strange numbness that comes from watching too much death too quickly? Perhaps the honest answer is that they were never only one thing. Guy de Chauliac's careful, detailed observations came from genuine devotion to understanding a disease that terrified an entire continent. Nostradamus's early willingness to abandon failing treatments in favor of cleanliness and simple remedies suggests a mind unwilling to simply accept tradition for its own sake. And Charles Delorme's invention, however scientifically flawed, gave frightened men and frightened towns something they desperately needed: the sense that someone, somewhere, was doing something. Maybe that's the quiet truth sitting beneath this entire story. In a moment when an entire society had no real answers, when even the finest medical minds of the age were reaching for herbs and vinegar and hopeful guesswork, what mattered wasn't always whether the treatment worked. What mattered was that someone still showed up, that a knock still came at the door of a dying stranger, even when comfort could offer little more than presence. We like to imagine history as a story of clear heroes and clear villains, but most of it, like most of us, lives somewhere quieter in between. Ordinary people doing difficult work for reasons that were rarely simple and rarely pure, yet mattering all the same. Perhaps that's worth carrying with you as you drift off tonight. Not every act of courage looks dramatic. Sometimes it simply looks like getting dressed in the morning and walking toward the very thing everyone else has learned to fear. And with that, our journey through the quiet, masked world of the plague doctor comes to a gentle close for tonight. Wherever you are, right now, whatever your day carried, you're safe, you're warm, and there's nothing waiting at your door but rest. Let your thoughts settle. Let the weight of the evening drift away. And if your eyes have already closed somewhere along the way, that means the story did exactly what it was meant to do. Until next time, rest easy.